Good morning, BookTube. We are back, and I am joined as ever by my special guest, The Highway, which loves to weigh in emotionally at very odd moments with a tooting truck or a vrooming motorcycle. But because it is Semana Santa weekend, it is a little quieter, thank goodness. So we shall see how this goes. I have been delighted to be relaunching this platform because you learn as you go. And I used to be absolutely nervous about this format because I detest it. It's as simple as that. In terms of performance, I'm a writer. I do not enjoy being in front of a video, but it is important to try to have real conversations. And today we are definitely going to try to have a conversation. But I want to reflect on what we've done so far first. When I relaunched this channel, we started by reviewing some short stories from Clark's World, and we are going to continue that next week with another issue review, because I think it is important to touch base with the actual writing in our genre as often as possible. I also looked at the differences between challenges for indie publishers and trad publishers, because both routes have issues. There are challenges, and you have to decide what is right for your work. We also looked at some of the surrounding fan culture. We looked at a range of podcasts, two specifically, but they do exist on opposite sides of a spectrum. Very casual readers getting together to shoot the shit about a particular piece of work, whether it's a film or a short story or a book. And on the other side, some very seasoned professional curators of content, people who were reviewing formally and serving as anthologists in the genre for decades. Interesting range, and good to establish a sort of set of parameters going forward. So we'll come back to all of these things. We'll continue to discuss culture through a variety of entry points. Today, I wanted to celebrate a new publication, and I think it's important to pay attention to the fact that even though there are many points of decline in our genre community, if one wants to call it, it's a delicate term, because we have an industry which has a very strong commercial function, but around it we have a body of people who use these genres to create a sense of identity and community. And it can sometimes be difficult to manage the parasocial interactions between people who are trying to build a career, to make money, and people who also just want to share in joy and engage in conversations about the work. So, it's wonderful when we have new voices joining, especially in a moment where so much of our news across the spectrum, outside of science fiction and fantasy as well, is losing not just a wide range of media outlets, but also the ability to hold a lot of different ideas in tension. The two go hand in hand. We have research that illustrates when you gut local media and you lose those touchstones with a wide range of possible media outlets, you also lose the ability for everyday people to experience different points of view, to understand different opinions and different lenses, and also to really group up around a sense of tribalism. And this is extremely painful to watch, because on the surface we think that we have a wide range of political points of view, but we're all human beings, and the vast majority of us are predisposed to risk aversion. We like to know what's safe, what's comfortable, what is going to serve us, and we like knowing who we should be opposing, what we should be trying to avoid. And this is a very difficult tendency to overcome. It can be overcome with a more humanities-oriented education, but it definitely is something strained in our current cultural context. We are exhausted by how many different forms of assault there are on our ability to live, to survive, to make a living, to live with a sense of maybe not camaraderie, but safety within our communities, where we can respect one another's differences. We don't have to worry about people trying to pathologize or stigmatize or drive certain groups out of the public sphere, it is exhausting and it is logical for us to try to shore up our lines of defense and to group up around our ranks. Unfortunately, it's counterintuitive to achieving the end that we want, which is a return to a more pluralistic society where we can have many voices and many opinions without those opinions being something that risks our life and our safety and our future. So, a publication like Typebar magazine is not necessarily going to be everyone's cup of tea. It has a very distinct point of view. We're going to get a sense of it as I read the about page for the publication. But I want to emphasize that we should not be thinking only in terms of trying to see a magazine or a new venue come out that serves us and only us, or us centrally. What we really want is an ecosystem where a multiplicity of voices can be heard and can be held in conversation with one another. So, I'll give you a taste of this publication through its mission statement, and then we're going to look at a piece, and we're going to reflect on how to read in a way that hopefully improves our overarching ecosystem. Okay, so here's Typebar magazine. Typebar magazine is an irreverent online magazine publishing literary analysis, cultural criticism, and stories about typewriters. It's the kind of place where you can expect to see an article about the true meaning of Judge Holden in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, sandwiched between an essay about Doug Walker's Kikassia and a discussion of the IBM Selectric typewriter. We want to make reading on the internet fun again. On the early internet, witty blogs and interesting essays were waiting around every corner. Remember the all, the toast, the outline? Today's internet is full of SEO spam, AI-generated garbage, deranged political agitprop, and outrage bait. Our editorial mission is to give people smart, thought-provoking, and fresh stories to read online. Oh, it's provocative, right? So, obviously, when you read a mission statement like that, a few things come to mind. You can see that there is a bit of a certain strain of nostalgia. It's a kind of small c conservative, dissident approach to the world right now on the internet. It also imagines like a heyday for the internet when things were better and not filled with nonsense. So there are plenty of places online too, even now, where you can find quote-unquote witty blogs and interesting essays. But this kind of assertion is necessary to establish what one is trying to do. So you know full well that there's going to be skepticism inside these pieces to many of the sort of mainstream projects and contemporary discourse that you'll probably find on Twitter, X, and other forums right now. And that's fine. That's fine. So the whole point is that we want tension. Friction makes the internet a better place. Friction makes our discourse a better place. And it is only the exhausting world we live in, which has gutted so much local media, gutted so many different forums, that we are left thinking that to be progressive, to be advancing some kind of better democratic vision of tomorrow, we have to group up and all share the same opinion under one large umbrella. And we miss the fact that the way back to that kind of healthier, democratic, thriving culture is through the ability to hold many voices in tension and not to immediately leap to any one position about them. So we're looking at a piece today that I don't fully agree with, and yet there's nothing wrong with not agreeing with something. When you review an essay, when you look at an argument, there are many things that one should be doing. And I say should in a very emphatic way. I'll say should be doing if one wants to move the conversation forward in a useful way. Let's think about in the contrast. There are ways to read this work that are not useful for conversation. One is to blanket endorse something because you like the name of the author, or you have the vague notion that's being presented in the piece seems to accord with your original point of view, so cool. Anything that vaguely supports my position is hunky-dory. On the other side, you can look at the name of the author and think, I know this person, I know their type. I know what they like and what they don't like. This person's probably more on the side of enemies and is probably not going to serve me well. And then you go in with a little bit of an edge. And then as you read it, you find any little tiny thread, any detail that you can pull at and say, oh yeah, I don't agree with that. That's why this whole piece is wrong. And it's useless, and it's dangerous, and it's not worth discussing. Both ways of reading are not useful for carrying forward a conversation. What is useful? Understanding the underlying point is important to be able to see what is the concern, what is the attention being paid to a part of our industry here, and do I agree or do I disagree? Are there any points of intersection around that ultimate fundamental thrust of the piece? And in this case, yes, there's an underlying component to this piece that I resonate with. I just don't think it manifested in the way that quite serves its argument well, but we'll get into that. The other thing you want to do is pay attention to how the argument is being structured, because that too will speak to a body of concerns and a body of ongoing conversation that will help you understand the state of the genre, the state of what's going on, what kind of tensions exist, how are people navigating and positioning themselves around the major issues and authors of the day. So you learn something. You don't have to agree with the work to be able to benefit from it. And I know that sounds a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir for some, but again, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that our world is so filled with core challenges to many people's right to exist that it becomes really easy for us to fall back into small c conservative, risk-averse behavior where we just want to know, are you on my side or not? The problem is that this kind of thinking seeds ground to the very kind of toxic culture that we're trying to fight. We want a world where pluralism wins, where we can have a multiplicity of voices and perspectives and subject positions, and they will sometimes be in tension, and there will be conflict between them, but in ways that are safe, healthy, and constructive. So, without further ado, let's take a look at this piece by Simon McNeil, Nobody Wants to Buy the Future, Why Science Fiction Literature is Vanishing. So I know a little bit about Simon McNeil and his priorities, and so I knew full well that there were definitely going to be some class-oriented concerns. They do come up here. And there's definitely also going to be a partiality to eco-criticism and thinking about science fiction in ways that really challenge some norms in our culture in favor of thinking differently and thinking in a more eco-conscious way about the world. So these are authorial biases, and they come up in certain aspects of the piece. We'll get to it. But the important thing first is to understand what is the general thrust. And the piece opens with a claim that science fiction readership is declining. Why? The argument being made is that it's declining in part because of some changes in broader media tie-in culture, sort of paucity of the imagination caused by certain franchises burning people out and leading to a lack of sort of broader ecosystem health for science fiction literature and films and in broader cultural communities conducive to excitement and growth. The other component is, and that the key component for this piece, is the idea that our culture has actually arrived at one of its science fictional futures. It is not a good future. And because it's not a good future, people are now really not keen to continue reading work that has a kind of breathless excitement about something we can see with our own eyes is mediocre at best, if dangerous at worst. For all of our techno-optimism sometimes in past generations, we are now seeing just absolute waste and a grinding decay of quality of life being tethered to things that we were told once would transform our way of living, ideally for the better, in certain forms of science fiction. So the idea in this piece is that part of the reason that people don't want to read science fiction literature anymore is because of this cynicism, well earned, from the way that billionaires today and other tech bros have abused some of the best components of the sort of dreamscape of science fiction in the past. So the piece moves from this notion of readership within science fiction to look at some of the other subgenres that have had their moment and are also experiencing a bit of a decline. And some of the elements discussed involve subgenres of escapism as a kind of very logical place for people to turn to when the science fiction itself is no longer offering sort of tech-oriented or innovation-oriented solutions. And the piece moves toward a critique of fan culture, so moving away from general readers toward writers and their own communities and what they have been celebrating, what they have been focusing on, which the author also finds to be a part of the problem. And this is where some readers of the work will absolutely gloss and say, yeah, absolutely 100% right. And others will say, oh, no, this is completely wrong. This person can't be trusted. And so you get that interesting division without engaging with underlying components. So I'm going to read a paragraph to give you a sense of the kind of perspective that's drawn from the author's personal bugbears, which are the bugbears of many others as well, which I think cause this piece to veer a little bit into the minutia and to miss the forest for the trees, but we'll get to that in a second. The mode preferred by the science fiction convention scene, often referred to as squeakcore, fails to provide us this in terms of the missing component he wants to see return to science fiction as a genre, as an industry, and as a community. Instead, it aims for a kind of optimistic declaration of progressive liberal victory that is at odds with the material conditions of a more general readership. Beyond this ideological framework, it also faces stylistic roadblocks as the tendency of squeakcore books to replicate a cinematic style that prefers the visual and kinetic elements of fiction creates a feedback loop where the books are aping movies that ape older books. So, not a fan of squeakcore. And you might not know what squeakcore is. It is very much enthusiastic. It is very much, we have to lean into the best and most wonderful possibilities. And it's funny because it's not that different in certain ways and on an aesthetic or a foundational level from tech optimism, which came in many forms of science fiction before. But it is sometimes a lot. Sometimes people really don't want that kind of euphoric excitement, that giddy reality. As he points out, that kind of quote-unquote progressive liberal victory at odds with the material conditions of a more general readership, that's a class-oriented comment about the fact that many of the people who say, I don't want to, the world's a really nasty, awful place. I'm just going to focus on positivity and joy, and here's a really nice tea that I like to buy from my local shop. Oh, and here's the community that I'm building around my cute little cultures. There is a class component to the kinds of people who can celebrate living in a gentler bubble, where it's like, oh, it's so awful what's happening in other countries. But you know what? I'm not going to let it ruin me or deprive me of joy. And my joy is a form of activism. And so I will lean into that as my activist path. That is a complicated conversation, and we have many people across the spectrum with different points of view about it. But it's an argument here that leads into a kind of division as well between what is science fiction that serves in a serious way and actually addresses the problem of the world or the many problems of the world. It would be nice if there was only one problem. But that division can cause problems with argumentation too. So the next point of his argument is to sort of contrast Jeff Vandermeer and a certain kind of science fiction he does that focuses a lot on ecological estrangement, the idea that our environment is changing a lot because of how we have informed its nature, and it creates a kind of alienness in our surrounding ecosystem and also in us. So it's a kind of, the term for it is new weird, and so we are supposed to be sitting in the science fiction with how estranged we are from our ecosystems and from any hope of a sort of better future of equilibrium within them. And it's definitely an interesting and very provocative form of literature. Wonderful that it exists. When it's positioned against the John Scalzi's, and John Scalzi has a different kind of fiction, which definitely is a little bit cozier, it's a little bit goofier, it plays into, there's a lot of fan service in his novels, so he's very much writing for the fans that he has already, and it's a different kind of fiction. But you put the two in an article like this, Vandermeer versus Scalzi, or you invoke a subgenre like squeakcore without necessarily identifying the fact that squeakcore and its insular bubble exists, as well as many other deeply problematic versions of the same complaint. A lot of tech optimism comes from people who are living in a Silicon Valley-esque environment, or they are able to benefit from or work with or alongside a lot of some difficult, challenging tech companies. They're going to have a different, more insular version of what is activism, what is progress, what is a proper liberal attitude toward the world at large. This is normal. Again, our publishing world is extremely regional, even though we forget about that fact. We love to think that our science fiction is more universal, more international, but especially Western publishing, there are a few core hubs that serve a lot of people who go to the same workshops, the same conferences, and belong often to the same class and are invested in by the same forms of industry. So we don't really get as much range as we like to pretend we do. And so there is a good space for a critique of fan culture in terms of being maybe too insular to write work necessarily reflecting the material conditions and needs of a lot of people, which is not to say that there aren't key components of the activism still manifesting in these communities, but as I mentioned, when we have lost a wider range of media and these become the sole voices or the most prominent voices without much competition, then we have a problem. And that's the kind of thing that this article is gesturing toward, is that our narrower approach to science fiction in terms of what is selling, what is becoming more prominent, reflects something a little bit concerning. It reflects a little bit of a detachment for some people. And that is a really interesting and important conversation to have. How do we write work that actually reflects the world and meets readers where they are? But especially because I know Simon McNeil has a lot of criticism that comes from strong skepticism about a lot of the capitalist elements of our industry, and the class critiques that come out in this piece are quite clear, and there's also a lot of the eco-criticism. I think I'm very comfortable situating my response to this piece within the materialist critique tradition in terms of actually looking at the material publishing context that he's talking about and the material conditions around some of the terms that he's using to see how valid are some of the surface elements of his claim. So one of the points that leaps out almost immediately when I look at the opening of this piece, he's talking about the decline in readership for science fiction. And my first question is, well, what's going on with readership in general? And I think some of you already know the answer. We know that readership in general is dropping. It is plummeting. We do not have the same body of readers in general. So we are suddenly dealing with a smaller pool of people who are using this medium to begin with. And again, as I mentioned, Typebar does have a focus that is a little bit more on the nostalgic side and a little bit more on imagining other eras where things were different. But it is important to pay attention to what is happening in the world in general, and then ask ourselves, even if reading in the past might have been a more accessible pursuit for people across class lines because there were libraries, because there were cheaper paperbacks, maybe the reading that we had in the past is not going to match with what is more accessible and what reaches the broadest number of people across different demographic lines today. Maybe reading is becoming itself a little bit of a classist pursuit, more perhaps than it was before. So there is a study from last year that had some really interesting data points, and I'm going to read from them. Okay, just a few of the important components. As the study found, is published in Publishers Weekly, this year's survey of public participation in the arts administered by the NEA every 5 years since 1982 found that in 2022, 53% of U.S. adults read literature and or books of some kind, compared to 57.1% in 2017. Data indicate a sharp decline in reading over the last decade. The percent of U.S. adults who read at least one book in print or electronically in 2022 was 48.5%, 6.1 percentage points lower than in 2012. The percent of U.S. adults who read literature, novels or short stories, poetry, and plays was lower in 2022 than in 2017. In particular, the percent of U.S. adults who read novels or short stories declined at a 17% rate from 45.2% in 2012 to 37.6% in 2022, the lowest share on record with the survey. Now, I'm quoting from this study in particular because there was just recently a news cycle complaining about Gen Z. The Zoomers are killing reading. Now, as a millennial, I am fully aware of the trend of blaming generations for the end of industries, killing cereal, killing marriages, or whatever. And so right now, Gen Z has had a moment where people are alarmed that youth are not reading. But I really enjoy this study for reminding us that almost none of us are reading to the same level that we used to in certain forms in terms of books. And what's happened instead, and many places have discussed this, is that we are spending a lot more of our time with text and visuals in other formats. So when we think about a classist critique, when we're thinking about the systems of power and how our storytelling reflects the world we live in and whether it reaches us where we are, we have to ask ourselves whether books right now are serving the same range of people as they used to. And unfortunately, part of the issue that I have with this piece is that there is a blurring of lines between science fiction literature and science fiction in general. It happens often in this piece. There's a sort of shifting back and forth. Science fiction literature is on the decline. Okay, wait. When was science fiction literature really on the rise? Only very recently. Before then, we had a wide range of publications and a lot more investment in paperbacks on spinner racks and all kinds of tie-ins for different cultures, and movie cultures as well, and TV show cultures were all tied into an ecosystem that had range, but really didn't try to elevate science fiction as much as it now does. Until very recently, we went through a moment when suddenly speculative fiction became high literary art and celebrated as such, and even then some of the first people to benefit from this rise, like Margaret Atwood, tried to separate themselves from, the old kind of science fiction, the sort of schlocky paperbacks of old. But we used to have a range. And I highlight this because, again, that range meant some beaten paperbacks were cheap. They were easy to acquire. It was very easy to make this form of media accessible to people across all walks of life. But a lot of the upscaling of science fiction is part of an industry push to commercialize, to commodify this product in a way that can also bring higher price tags to the work. And so there's been this vicious competition within genre for the last couple of decades that's taken out, again, you might be sensing a general theme, a wide range of diversity of forms. They do still exist, though, and that's where another part of the piece, I think, is missing. Because as I mentioned, media is changing. So does this mean that if people aren't reading science fiction, they're not engaging with science fiction? No. What's missing in this piece is any discussion of video games, which are our home movies in which many of us can play and partake in a way that we weren't able to with films and other cultures and other cultural moments. So, for instance, in the 80s, which again is this nostalgic era in this article, you certainly did have a lot of tie-in culture, but not just between movies and books. You would also go to the arcade and play a pinball machine or a stand-up arcade game that had a lot of the same motifs and a lot of the same character designs. The artwork there would be very exciting. There would be other forms of tie-in with other media that are missing from this article. And it's important that they're missing from this article because there are also huge industries, huge franchises outside of Marvel. And if you're going to talk about the kind of cultures of science fiction today, where is it thriving? you have to include what happened to the World of Warcraft books, the Warhammer books, the Halo books, the Minecraft books. Those have absolutely met a key demographic which used to be met by a lot more of those spinner rack science fiction novels. So again, in his piece, he talks about a certain demographic of reader for science fiction, and it's an older demographic right now than it used to be. As he notes, most academic work on science fiction readership indicates that the genre skews toward adults aged 30 to 45, above average wealth and education, and that its readers tend to be heavy readers who engage regularly with other science fiction media. But historically, science fiction is supposed to enlighten and animate the minds of youth, and it certainly had periods where there was lots of wonderful juvenile fiction and even older fiction getting into the hands of juveniles. Just fantastic tie-ins, and that's where you get especially the excitement over some movies of the 1980s, as well as tie-in novels. Then we also, how can I forget, on top of the tie-in novels for Star Wars, you also had Star Trek tie-ins, but they were cheap, they were fun, they were accessible, and we don't quite have as much prominence given to those pieces when we're talking about science fiction literature, which means we're missing a part of our demographic. We're missing a huge component of what makes science fiction come alive for many young people today. And I also want to note, when we talk about this fetishization of the 1980s did have some wonderful films that were splendidly innovative, and sometimes when you watch Marvel movies today, you can think, I miss that age. But it is important to remember that age also had its commercial focus. There's a wonderful episode of 99% Invisible that I recommend. 573 is the number. It's called Toyetic, and it reflects on the 40th anniversary of the launch of a certain kind of science fiction specifically to sell toys. And we loved them. It gave us our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It gave us our Transformers. But it's a fantastic episode for talking about how these franchises came to life, and many others like them, specifically to sell products, because it is a very commercial form of science fiction, and yet culture builds around it. So every era has had these commercial moments and these concerns. And it is important to remember those side components that have a lot more of a tie-in to other media forms. So in the 1980s, toys, and right now, video games. Really important to consider in our analysis of what's happening to the genre, as well as the question of what's happening to reading in general. Does reading today reflect as broad an audience and reach as many people across demographics as we want it to? So to tie this up a little bit, it is a really important point that is being made at the core of this piece, that there is something weird happening in science fiction where it is narrowed to a certain kind of insular group of fan bubbles and readership bubbles, to the extent that we sometimes don't even realize all the other bubbles that exist concurrently. We're just focused on the ones in our industry or our slice of industry, and the bugbears that we might have around, I can't believe that this is popular right now in this circle, people should be reading this other thing instead. All of it speaks to a deeper problem, which is that we do not have a diverse enough media landscape to be able to really hold in tension all of the components of what makes science fiction and fantasy a wide, thriving community, and what serves us as human beings trying to tell stories as best we can about the world we live in. We need to have that better conversation. So there is a lot of sickness at the heart of what McNeil is writing about here. We do have to question some of our premises with respect to, just because reading in the past was the answer, should we expect it necessarily to be the answer going forward? Is there something we need to consider with respect to the future forms of science fiction? Do they need to be certain rigid genre categories, commercial categories, or should we be thinking instead in a broader way about our storytelling? What stories do we need to tell to reach people, to engage people, to affirm people in a variety of subject positions, and how can we tell them best in this cultural moment? So that's a really great conversation that comes out of a piece in a new publication, Typebar magazine. I look forward to reading the pieces that are produced going forward. I might not agree with them either in terms of the work in future editions, But you don't have to necessarily agree with everything to see the kernel of a really useful conversation or useful insight into how industry is being perceived by others in it. And as long as we can continue to try to practice holding in tension different points of view and really sitting with the arguments of other people in our genre, we are not going to be able to move forward. So it's very important for us to try our best to celebrate even the launch of things that might not fully accord with our own positions. It's fine. And really just try to celebrate the existence of multiplicity of voices. Don't fall into scarcity politics. Don't fall into anxiety about tribalism, and see what happens. I mean, that is the wonder of innovation and the imaginative landscape, and it's something, unfortunately, that can be presented as in peril and move us into the wrong direction. But thankfully as well, we can always change the course, and that's what we're going to do. Fingers crossed. Next week, we'll be back with fiction. Thank you so much for taking time today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend. Much obliged. Cheers all.